John is the president of Positive Energy Practice, an urban systems engineering firm based on data-driven decision-making for sustainable new building design, retrofits, and urban master planning. John's career has focused on developing and applying technology to improve the urban environment. From 2010 to 2013, he was Chief Technology Officer for the City of Chicago. That was when he came and spoke first to the city. He was leveraging technology to streamline public services through more efficient data sharing, digital communications, and next-generation infrastructure. John led the development of the City of Chicago Technology Plan. In 2012, the White House recognized John as a, quote, champion of change, unquote, as part of a group of creative individuals engaged in building stronger communities through innovative approaches to problem solving. Ladies and gentlemen, John Tolva, our moderator. Thank you, John.
Hi, everybody. Before I introduce the panelists, I wanted to kind of frame the discussion today a little bit. It's an exciting group, but I want to talk about two topics that are probably very dear to many of you, urban solutions and Chicago's leadership in that space. So cities are the most complex thing that humans have ever created. You may not think of cities as products like you do an automobile or a piece of software, but they are designed, built, and maintained like any other complex device. They function, sometimes they break, but they allow us to achieve things we couldn't if we were still scattered in low-density, kind of agrarian settlements. Here's the thing. The pace of urbanization is accelerating. 2007 was the first time in human history that more people lived in cities than not. Metropolitan areas are now home to more than 50% of humanity. And the UN predicts that by 2050, 70% of humans will live in cities. The problem is that our infrastructure cannot support this influx. Our roads, rails, pipes, bridges, grids, and structures were all built on a different demographic calculus. This isn't a technological issue so much as a moral imperative. We need to figure out how to make our metropolitan regions function more efficiently, more livably, as the world urbanizes. So there's good news, and CityWorks is part of that good news, the city initiative at UI Labs. Study after study shows that urban density offers the most sustainable way to live. Cities use less energy and emit less pollution per capita than other ways of living. Services are shared, energy is saved. When it works properly, the urban experience is the most efficient way to live. And the other good piece of news that we're about to talk about is technology. Data analysis, predictive modeling, and network devices change the way we know the world. Listening to very, very closely to what the natural world was telling us gave birth to environmentalism and sustainable design. Now we're at the point of being able to listen just as closely to the built environment. What we need to figure out is what that information is telling us, and that's what we're going to hope to do today. So let me invite the panelists up to the dais, and I will introduce. Very good. So starting at the end, Brenna Berman. Brenna leads the City of Chicago's Department of Innovation and Technology. She's the Commissioner and the Chief Information Officer. Brenna spearheads Mayor Emanuel's commitment to open data and data-driven government, building Chicago's open data program into one of the largest in the country. She implemented the groundbreaking WindyGrid spatial analytics platform in every level of government, integrated advanced data analytics and real-time data-driven decision-making in the city. Brenna has built a career doing this. During a 10-year stint at IBM, where we were together, she worked closely with government agencies and cities and countries around the world to leverage technology. Brenna earned her bachelor's degree and master's in public policy from the University of Chicago. Next to Brenna is Dave Hopping. Dave is the president and CEO of Siemens' North American-based Building Technologies division. Dave joined Siemens in 1989. He's not that old.
Boy, I look good.
He leads, he's been doing smart cities for a long time. He leads operational and commercial activities for Siemens' broad portfolio of products and services across building automation, energy management, fire safety, and security solutions for buildings, facilities, and enterprises across all industries in the Americas. Dave got his Bachelor of Science degree in electrical engineering from Purdue University. Next to Dave is Daniel Lewin. Daniel leads Microsoft's work in civic tech. He's the Vice President of Technology and Civic Engagement. Now that incorporates campaign technologies, academic outreach, and promotes the work of scholars leading the dialogue on technology policy issues. Previous to that, Daniel led Microsoft's global engagement with startups and venture capitalists and business relationships with strategic industry partners. Daniel has executive and site responsibility for the company's operations in Silicon Valley, which currently employs more than 2,000 people. Daniel holds an AB in politics from Princeton University. And last but not least is Carolyn Nowinski, who many of you know. She serves as the executive director and chief operating officer of UI Labs, which maybe there's some in the audience that don't know what UI Labs is. It's a Chicago-based research and commercialization collaborative bringing industry, academia, and government together to apply real solutions to tomorrow's most important business, economic, and cultural challenges. Carolyn did her undergrad work at Northwestern, has an MBA from UIC, and a medical doctorate from the University of Illinois College of Medicine. So there are pieces of paper that you can write questions on. You can tweet to me or use that hashtag. I'll be checking that up here. I'll ask some questions to the panelists, and then we'll have at least 15 minutes for questions from the audience. So Brenna, let's start with you. The mayor wrote in his tech plan that the city will implement policies and basic infrastructure that make Chicago friendly to technology experimentation, allowing Chicago to become a global leader in developing solutions, kind of the city as a lab.
Yes.
Sounds a lot like what's happening in the city initiative at UI Labs. Can you explain the thinking behind that goal?
Sure. He did write that, and then he gave me that job. He's good like that. He comes up with ideas, and then he assigns them. So the idea there was pretty simple, right? The city has some very, very big problems that we need to get solved if Chicago is going to continue to grow and thrive. And we know that we don't have all of those answers today with either the solutions that we have in city government now or with the solutions that we can even buy from the many vendors that come and see me on a regular basis. So we wanted to make Chicago available, our right-of-ways, our buildings, the infrastructure we have today. We wanted to make the city available as a kind of urban lab for organizations to come and test their solutions to the problems of energy efficiency, to the problems as simple as potholes, how easily we get them, how hard they are for us to keep up with them. Any urban problem that makes it harder for our residents to live happy, productive lives, we wanted to make the city available as a lab to build new solutions for that. And where UI Lab comes in is we don't think that the traditional model of developing those solutions is necessarily the best way to come up with the right answers, right? Academia is inventing new technologies today that don't commercialize fast enough. Companies don't necessarily always have the best access to us to understand the problems deeply enough. We needed better ways to work together, and UI Labs gives us those partnerships.
Carolyn, so DMDII, the Digital Manufacturing Institute, which was the first program at UI Labs, is up and running. To what degree did the lessons learned there inform your decision to go, there must have been a point where you said, what's our next project? And you decided to focus on city infrastructure. How did that work?
So UI Labs provides a platform for collaboration. I mean, essentially, we are the group where universities and companies and governments can come together, and we can give them a framework to make it a little bit easier to work together, as Brenna just talked about. And so as we developed our first program, and really as we developed UI Labs altogether, we were looking for three things as we thought about programs. One, we wanted problems that were big enough to matter. But we also wanted problems that were too big for any one company or any one university to solve on their own, for which Chicago was uniquely situated to solve them. And so with manufacturing, it was easy. We used to be the tool belt capital in the Midwest. Chicago has a legacy in manufacturing. And so what better way to create the new tools in manufacturing, digital tools, right here based in Chicago? When it came to smart cities, it also seemed to be a very logical choice. It was a choice that was informed by the mayor's tech plan and the commitment of the city to open up its data and open up its infrastructure. And it was also a recognition that we've got incredible assets here as it relates to smart city experimentation. Not only did we literally have the city of Chicago to be able to use as our laboratory, but the universities and the national labs around here each have distinct opportunities to tap into, from transportation centers at UIC and Northwestern, Urban Center for Computation and Data at University of Chicago and Argonne, civil engineering and computer science at University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, design and architecture at IIT. We had all of the pieces, and it was a matter of being able to pull them together in a way that the city and the companies can tap into. The first thing we wanted was a problem we're uniquely situated to solve. The second thing that we want it to be something that really matters to industry. And in that case, we were really fortunate, first with Microsoft stepping up to the table, who was a partner in DMDII, and recognizing that they've got a framework that's going to make it easier. And so if we take that framework and bring it into another area, then maybe there's an opportunity to do work in transforming another industry. So Microsoft was the first to come, but then very quickly our founding members rounded out with Siemens and Accenture and ComEd and HBK Engineering and Level 1 Communications, all of whom are out there somewhere today. And we're already inviting new partners to the table. It had to make sense to industry, and it had to really be driven by them. The third thing that we needed, and we learned from DMDII, if you don't root it in really solving problems that have commercial outcomes, then that too doesn't really matter. So many of the challenges that we have with startups and university inventions is actually getting those solutions into the marketplace. So we needed the big companies to recognize there's a problem, and then we needed to put a platform together so they can actually solve the problems that result in commercial outcomes. So with those three things in mind, we learned it firsthand with DMDI. We're still learning it. But then we could take those same principles and apply it to our Smart Cities program, and we're just getting off the ground, but we're off to a great start.
Well, it does make a lot of sense to build on what Chicago has proven itself to be good at. I mean, it's true that this is still the place that people come for the best architecture, the best engineering. Why shouldn't we be the place that they come, we the city, for the latest in urban innovation? But just to play the devil's advocate for a second, Daniel, I mean, this isn't the first time people have been talking about smart cities. The private sector and IBM, where I used to work, has been talking about it for the better part of a decade. What do you think differentiates this initiative from those? From previous sort of IT enterprise-y type smart city ways of framing the problems?
Well, I think it's a fair question. From the Microsoft perspective and why we're here and why we think this initiative is sort of the cornerstone for us in the sense that civic engagement, civic technology, these are new experimental phenomenon, and it is a new environment. You described it well up front about it's time to look at the physical environment and the people who live within it and how those things interact. If you went sort of into the past and you looked at top-down attempts where you could say we're going to come in and solve the problem and make us smarter or whatever. It's not how we go about things at our company, and it's frankly typically not how markets evolve particularly well. There's an ecology that needs to be built up that includes broad horizontal technologies and machine learning. It includes regulatory regime considerations. So we're going to do this within some set of rules because we live in a civil society. Those things will logically change over time as well. There's a need to think about the vertical or tactical points of presence where people will interact with environment and sensors will be present over time. 10 years ago, you couldn't do those things. Mm-hmm. Today, you can. So we have approached this whole area of civic tech and civic engagement by picking at a corporate level a small number of areas to make investments. And Chicago is our first city in that regard, where we stepped up as a result of the work that was going on with UI Labs, the contact we had with the mayor's office going back a couple, 3-4 years with our CEO. And coming from, as you pointed out in my background, having worked with startups and venture capitalists, starting in Silicon Valley, but then across the US and then around the world, bringing to the table a market-centric, really first principles about how ecosystems emerge and disruptive new things happen. They start in the small and then they scale. And so the opportunity here is to partner, Siemens and others, as you said, and to bring the best principles forward within the context of the laboratory that the city's presented, that the mayor's behind, but recognizing that the whole fabric is going to be woven over time by big companies, small companies, entrepreneurs, university research. And for us, scalable and replicable systems over time is the outcome that we'll look for.
Yeah, I think the open data movement and the way, for instance, that Brenna conducts the IT work in the city kind of caught big IT companies off guard. You know, it is not about a monolithic solution that comes in. But the good news is every municipal employee and bureaucrat in the world has heard of smart cities.
Yeah.
Right? They just don't know. Typically, it's, so what software should I buy to do that? And I see the city initiative at UI Labs, you know, showing the nuance in that and proving in a real place that it can be done.
Well, you said that, you know, the fundamental issue, it's the citizenry, it's the people in the city. So it's the sensors and the ambient intelligence that's present in the environment when things are sensed, and these machines can understand the data under the right parameters of security and privacy and all the things that will be affected as a result of these changes. And so the customer isn't, quote unquote, the city. You can't walk into the city and say, the city should buy this, if you will. It's the fact that you've got a wired environment, you've got an individual market, the person is the market who's present on the network, then how do you interact with the new ecology of the physical environment of a city where water and energy and physical infrastructure all really matter, which is, you know, that's really...
Well, so Dave, I mean, obviously cities aren't abstractions, they're made of things, and most of those things are buildings. With your experience in building technology innovation, how do you see that as part of, you know, urban scale solutions? How does such an approach to, you know, automating and making buildings smarter scale to the city, you know, size?
Yeah, in general, there's a big need and there's a big opportunity. And when you talk about smart buildings, you can't really talk about, when you talk about smart cities, you can't really talk about smart cities without talking about buildings. I mean, look around when you come here to this event, there's buildings everywhere, and it touches everything we do, live, work, play. And then when you couple that with, you know, some of the mega trends that's happening, and you mentioned some of those, John, more and more people moving to cities, you know, the infrastructure can't handle it. It's also not sustainable from an environmental perspective. And on top of it, there's no money, you know, to upgrade the infrastructure. It's a big problem and a big challenge. The opportunity lies in the fact that buildings typically consume over 40% of the total energy usage in the world are consumed in buildings, and produce over 21% of the total carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. And so from a sustainability standpoint, it's not sustainable just to keep building and building and building without it doing something different. So there's a big need, there's a big opportunity from a cost standpoint. There's opportunities to save cost, you know, in buildings. You know, over 32% of the total life cycle cost in a building comes from energy usage, which might surprise some folks, even more so than the operations use. So leveraging new innovation, leveraging new technologies, leveraging the move into software and Internet of Things and data and analytics will allow us to build buildings better, cheaper, more cost effective, but also save substantial operating cost and energy cost, you know, in buildings.
So feel free, anyone, to answer the next set of questions, but I'm sure people are wondering, what are the problems that are trying to be solved here? What are the use cases? You know, what kind of infrastructure improvement projects are you considering undertaking? Anybody?
So I'll jump in first because I think before we even talk about what problems are we doing, it's how do we even get to the problems? Because I think that's one of the things that we've all worked through as a partnership over the last several months, and thinking about how do we make sure that we're taking problems that are actually something that we can prove a commercial outcome within a reasonable amount of time, within a reasonable amount of money. And so we've now have a process in place for bringing our company partners, our university partners, and our city partners together in a way that we really focus on first and foremost defining the problem. So there's a number of commissioners and deputy commissioners in the room that have been working with us on this plate, and it's been, you know, really informative and really exciting to see about how we think about problems differently when you get these three groups together that don't always have that opportunity to even spend time together in a neutral way where you can kind of, you know, close the door and have a conversation where you're able to understand really what is that problem. And from there, we can actually start designing what are the right teams to tackle those problems to actually deliver real outcomes. I'll touch briefly on one of the first projects that we're getting off the ground, and then I'll let my fellow panelists chime in. But one of the I think more exciting projects is understanding how we use green infrastructure for stormwater management. And if some of you have experienced the storms of last week and this week as I have, this is a problem near and dear to your heart. There is an incredible amount of investment that cities, municipalities are making in using green infrastructure, things like permeable pavements and curb bump outs and technologies that are not the typical, gray infrastructure, to then better understand how does stormwater drain? How do you prevent flooding? And the challenge is we don't necessarily know how well those work and how different green infrastructure elements might work better in one environment, on one street, or one neighborhood versus another one. And so how can we make better decisions? How can our cities make better decisions about where to make those investments, but how can architects, developers, building owners, how can communities think about how these infrastructure elements are actually put to work? And so we're working with professors at the University of Illinois, who are also here somewhere, looking at some of the cutting edge technology that they have in communications and video analytics and other new sensing technologies to be able to put in low cost ways of measuring what are these infrastructure elements doing? How are they helping? Are they helping with stormwater management? And then ultimately being able to add on to that project over time to better understand how the drainage systems within cities work.
Okay, well, let's say that works. Let's say you figure out a great stormwater management system. How do you measure the impact of that? Because as Daniel said, the customer isn't necessarily the city. I mean, actually, Commissioner Shore from the MWRD is here, and obviously she'd love something like that. That's probably a customer. But how do you measure impact, given that Brenna's goals are different from Dave's goals, are different from Daniel's goals? You know what I mean? And there's many more partners there.
Frankly, I think just to jump in on that every partner will measure it based upon their particular business case for participating. For us, it's the long-term implications of using big machine architectures, these so-called cloud services, and the gathering of information from these teeny little machines, these sensors. So it's kind of the world for us as a company transitioning from, if you will, more licensed software and office automation to data-rich, sensor-rich environments where big scale-out machine architectures are going to capture lots of data and do the analysis work where the domain experts will be the ones driving the engines, but we'll provide the infrastructure. And so it's the rise of the big machines and the rise of the little machines at the same time with software in the middle. That's the way we think about it. So for us, it's very, very long-term. But inevitably, our business is tied to partnering and working with others. In current form, it's about 700,000 partners around the world that make our P&L strong. And this is a new world of new kinds of solutions that is metro-centric, as you pointed out, the demographic trends. And so understanding this ecology, both from the standpoint of what the software can do, but also partnering with the political leaders and the regulatory regimes and the universities, both for technical experiment, but also for policy issues. Because there's an inevitability where technology is going to bump up against policy, and we're going to have changes in the regulatory regime as a result of it. So we invest on those fronts as well. So for us, it's understanding the environment within which we think our business can grow. And for the size and scale of our business, this is sort of an ideal test bed because there's political will, incredible physical environment, and a community, World Business Chicago and others, that's coming together to support the mayor's agenda, which again makes Chicagoland a strong place. So for us, it's that whole ecosystem play.
Yeah, yeah, I'd like to add to it. From a Siemens perspective, there's two big components. Number one is, can we do something innovative and unique and different here that can be scalable, that we can take around the world, to other cities? Can Chicago be the leader in creating something new that we can take forward? And with Siemens being a global company, and actually the head of our city program globally is here today, we're looking to see what we can do different and take around. So scalable, repeatable. We're not looking for something just a one-off sale here locally. The second topic for us is, can we do something bigger and greater by collaborating, with great companies like Microsoft, Accenture, and Edison that we couldn't do on our own. Right. So for us, those are the two big measurements.
Okay. A question has already come in, but I was going to ask this anyway. This initiative exists in a national and international ecosystem of smart cities initiatives.
Right.
You heard a couple weeks ago, Google created this thing called Sidewalk Labs. Here we've got Built Worlds, we've got the Urban Center for Computation and Data down at University of Chicago, and then you have what I'm just going to say is probably the most thriving civic tech community in the United States, much of which orbits around Dan O'Neill and the Smart Chicago Collaborative. How do you play in a field as noisy as that? How do you, differentiate what's going on with the city initiatives from some of these others? How do we compete or collaborate?
I'll give you my point of view because we have a company initiative that spans the globe, roughly speaking 300 cities where we're paying attention. We do business all around the world. And we look at this as a unique place to invest and collaborate for the reasons that Dave just said, and to build on what Carolyn said, that the universities are at the table. There's a strong commitment to experimentation, defining problems in a collaborative way with highly optimized and incentivized individuals around the table, people coming from their specific domains, world-class in every instance. And the problem definition is more than half the problem. And so we just think this is a place where, again, with political will, that demonstrable successes, to Dave's point, can be scaled around the world. We find one-off examples in our subsidiary or country operations that occur in any given city. Interesting things being done in London around using cell phone technology to allow people who are blind to navigate a physical city by pinging the environment. All kinds of interesting experiments, but it looks to me like Chicago's the place where we can bet on the long-term, multi-year, with great partners.
I think to add to the value of the civic ecosystem here, if UI Labs were to compete, which isn't the model, but were to compete with the civic partners here, that would be a losing bet. And so the point is to collaborate, and that's been the model that's put in place, because if you don't take advantage of the ecosystem here, then you're not taking advantage of everything that the city has to offer. So the point of that partnership model is to add to the strong, large corporate partners with everything that's available here in Chicago.
If I just add one point there, it's because of the ecosystem precisely for why we can do this here that other cities haven't been able to pull the pieces together. And so that's what's going to allow us to create this way to not only replicate in other cities, but even be able to do it time and time again here. So we just continue to get stronger.
And it's totally additive. I mean, there's a sharing process that's going on a global basis. And mayors, of all the political leaders in the world these days, especially if you think US-centric, mayors can get things done. And at other levels in government these days, it's very, very hard. And so betting on cities and betting on places where you have political will is really important.
Mayor, Brenna, I know you are. You are the mayor
thank
to me,
you.
Brenna.
Yeah.
You
Not a job I
stand
want.
for city government.
Not a job I want.
Commissioner Berman.
That's a job I'll take.
You have a network of peer CIOs
Yes.
and CTOs around the world. Is anything like this happening elsewhere? I mean, obviously there are corporate initiatives, but something like this?
Well, no, there's the London City Catapult, which is probably the initiative that's most similar to this one, and the initiative in Singapore, which is a nation state, so that's a little bit different. But those are the two that are probably closest, and we've talked with them. I know Carolyn's talked with them as she was getting UI Labs up and running. I've talked with my CIO counterparts there, and they have slight differences, but in the U.S. there's nothing like
And
this.
the people in London will say Chicago's a place that's happening in the U.S.
Right.
I mean, just
Yeah.
to validate what you
Yeah,
say, that's
absolutely.
what we hear as well. So all roads seem to point in this
Excellent.
direction.
But I would add.
Yeah, please.
I would add, I think there's an opportunity to collaborate across cities and learn from cities. I mean, there's a lot of activity in Asia taking place.
Yes.
I mean, they're building new cities almost 50 new cities every year.
Absolutely.
From the ground up, which is a very unique situation, opportunity that we don't have here. And
Different problem.
It's one of the things that we're hoping in Siemens to bring to the table is leverage, what's going on in other cities and other parts around the world into the innovation sector that we can learn from as well. So, yeah, I think that Chicago is ahead, definitely in the Americas, but there's still an opportunity to collaborate across cities.
Okay, just a reminder to get questions in on a piece of paper. We'll take those in just a second, or just tweet up here and I'll sift through the noise and find the questions. One last question to the whole panel. Chicago's enjoyed a really thriving entrepreneurial scene. People ask all the time, when are we going to become Silicon Valley? And the truth is, where we've shown success is building on prior industrial success, hence the DMDII, hence the kinds of startups we have here build on centuries-old legacy. Do you see a touch point, any points of tangency with startups, with the entrepreneurial community? I mean, not just civic tech hackers, but what I'd love to see is that at the periphery of the city initiative at UI Labs, that you get entrepreneurs who are kind of latching on to that.
Absolutely. I mean, I think some of you can comment on some of the specifics. It's about building a collaboration platform that brings all the right players to the table. The startups are an integral piece of that. In the same way that we look to universities as sources of innovation for companies that don't necessarily, don't have all of the right pieces inside, need to be able to go out in the ecosystem and find those. The startup world is similarly a source of innovation. And so we've got to bring them to the table. Plus, as we do some of our projects, not all cases is, Microsoft or Siemens going to be the one that's taking the product to market. They're one partner in a larger group. It may be that it is a startup that's ultimately commercializing an outcome and taking it into the marketplace.
Like spun out of UI Labs?
I think if we look at other institutes, other applied research institutes, there are certainly precedent that coming out of a project, an outcome can go one of two ways. The group that is participating in the project can be those that commercialize it, or it could be that those participating in the project are ultimately the customers or the partners, and a whole new company needs to be formed in order to commercialize that outcome. And so I think we're just getting off the ground with our first projects, but come a year, 2 years from now, as we start seeing those outcomes, because these projects are designed to be short-lived, I think it's an inherent link to the startup system.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, having spent a dozen years looking at the startup ecosystem around the world and the enablers to that, in a similar fashion, we did not go out there and suggest that we could wave a magic wand and that entrepreneurs would surface and do interesting things in big cities. But we looked at the environment and the characteristics in every metropolitan area where there were major research institutions and enough capital and the kind of will, in many cases, cultural issues and regulatory issues are, make things hard, if you will. It's really hard to start a business in Germany, for example, but they do have a burgeoning entrepreneur ecosystem in Berlin now because they're starting to do other interesting things. So looking at the environments around the world, I think it's inevitable that new companies will blossom as a result of the work that happens here. How and when, you never know. That's just an outcome of the collision of big companies partnering, research coming to the table, us looking at things that aren't typically commercially off the shelf, but hopefully constructive experiments that can be applied and scaled over time. So we think there'll be economic impact, and whether that turns out in a new co or greater good in terms of cost offsets for the city or the building operator infrastructure partners or growth for Siemens or us, all those things will happen, I think.
Great. Let's take some questions from the audience. So Dory McWhorter tweeted and sent hard copy up. Thank you. It's the same question.
Not to be ignored.
Hi, Dory, wherever you are. It's a good question, though. How do we engage, educate, involve the broader citizenry, everybody in Chicago, with the concept of smart cities? I mean, that's a hard question to top, but it's an easy one to answer. Please do.
Right. Yeah.
No, go.
So one
Ms.
thing
Mayor.
is complementary, and UI Labs will be involved. This past March, the city launched the IoT Council, which is broader than smart cities, but leverages the the technology. And in September, all of the communications and educational material that we'll be putting together will be focused on smart cities, blog posts, webinars, et cetera. So that'll be one way to do that, and UI Labs will be working with us to put those materials together. So that'll be one way to do it.
You got your Chicago Next and other programs, and there are field programs going on and that I'm and our team is generally aware of that we're helping facilitate, where young people from various ages, right, training and learning and getting people aware, and then ideally the broader opportunity to communicate. Again, I think that's where political will and the mayor's voice and the staff's participation go a long way.
Yeah, I mean, I think I know Dory well enough to kind of channel her here and say that, you know, we have been talking a lot about infrastructure, about physical things, about the things, the sum of which doesn't actually equal a city because it's missing people. And if you go back and look at sort of the early ideas around smart cities, they were these kind of gleaming utopias of trains running on time, but there were no people in them, you know, which actually those cities exist in the Far East.
They're in China, no.
Seems to me that given that we are known for, you know, digitally enabling everyone, things like Smart Chicago, things like the Brenna's outreach, that it is such a big part of what we're doing that has to be woven in with the infrastructure somehow. The sum is what Chicago is.
Yeah,
Hope I said that right, Dory.
Yeah, can I add to it?
Yeah, please.
Yeah. So not because I was sitting next to you at lunch, but it was an excellent question. But I think it's absolutely critical. Otherwise, it's a tagline. You know, it's a PowerPoint presentation. It's it's a lot of words, coming out from a consultant's mouth, hypothetically. But I think if there's a way to get the city involved, in it, and I don't have the answer, but maybe it's focus groups, or maybe it's identifying the problems in the city that might come not just from the city departments, but from the people that live and work in the city. That might be an area. I think reporting back on results to the city is important, especially topics like sustainability, green, energy efficiency. A lot of people care about. And so if you can find some connection points to engage them, in the process, might sound easier said than done, but I think that's an opportunity for us.
So a couple questions have come in sort of on the same theme. I'll just join them into one. Kevin asks, what's the biggest threat to this experiment's success? Political leadership, question mark. Another question came in, wondering about the privacy implications. Clearly you've done kind of a risk analysis and have thought this through. How might this not work?
Well, these are the kinds of things that
We
keep
didn't
me
prep
up
for
at
that
night,
question, did we?
so,
That's a good question.
I can answer it.
Yeah.
No, go.
Go ahead, Dave.
No, I think one of the challenges is around this IP topic. You bring a lot of companies to the table, some big, some small, and you're going to create something new. You're going to create innovation, and who owns that? How do you leverage that? How do you to share in the success of that? It's not a negative comment. It's just the question was, what's a risk? I would say that's one of the risk topics if we don't figure that out.
Yeah, and your point about privacy and security issues is an example. I mean, the experiments, by definition, sometimes they flare up and fail, and sometimes they succeed, but you have to learn from them. The unintended consequences of all of the data that the city has an opportunity to make available, right? I mean, it's legally okay to make certain data sets available. So one of the research experiments that we've been working on with the university, the principals doing the investigation around a large city in the United States, they looked at all the data sets, and they looked at the terms by which the data could be made available. They studied all of those things, and then they came up with 3 principles, which is that the data could be pushed out by the city. The data could be pulled out because someone or an entity said, I have a right to that data, so it gets pulled out. And then the other case is it can spill out. And part of the issue is these things overlap, the quote unquote, the consequences of data sets being combined and what you can see, what are the broader implications. Even in a social setting that is very, very current today, when you think about police and body cams, having a conversation from a civil rights perspective on that topic is complicated. And you might think, well, of course, if everybody had a body, then that would be it's really a hard problem when you really get down to it. So as you start to think, and that is data, because that's imagery that's going to get stored. So the downside risk is we stumble into some of these things, and the unintended consequences are we make a mistake. Well, so we have to learn from that, and I think people in principle need to be aware of the fact that this is going to happen inevitably. There is a march forward with technology, and we're looking for the greater good. So shining a light on these, both defining the problems and then understanding when there's an issue, and then how you recover from it or what you do with it is the opportunity. And you can be a leader, but if you're a leader, you're going to get an arrow or two at the same time. So.
Let me add just one point to that, which is I think we as Chicago have an advantage in that we're working on mitigating these factors real time. So some of the same challenges, intellectual property and cybersecurity that we just talked about, we're not just seeing in our Smart Cities program, we're already experiencing them in digital manufacturing.
Absolutely.
And Microsoft and Siemens are both partners in that as well. And so we have I think an advantage to be able to learn and have this experiences from the labs build on top of one another. And so
Actually, that's really interesting. How many companies are partners of both?
actually, two.
Just two. Okay.
We get along, you know.
Because it could
He's
be.
much older than I am, though, remember.
But actually interesting, that two entirely
following.
different groups within the companies too.
Right, but they must talk, and it would be
We must talk.
interesting if a new manufacturing technique, something new in material science, was actually applied at a city scale, right? I mean, that's sort of cross-initiative collaboration would be very cool. Dave, a question specifically to you, I think primarily because Siemens is the most infrastructural of the companies, at least more so in some ways than Microsoft. The question is, knowing what you know about Chicago, what you've seen, what types of infrastructure improvements would you recommend? I mean, this is not necessarily a question about what are you going to do at UI Labs, but what are some of the things that we could be doing better, just in general?
Yeah, well, there are opportunities.
I'm sure. I only deal with the technical infrastructure, just so we're clear.
There's an incredible opportunity for energy reduction and energy savings in the city of Chicago, and the city's done some work in this space, but the opportunity is incredible. I think there's a big opportunity with the city and businesses in the city to reduce maintenance cost or operational cost in running their buildings. It's a huge cost. It's growing every year. And I'll tie the pieces together a little bit, but there's a big opportunity to use data and connection points and analytics tied to that data to reduce maintenance cost and only perform maintenance when it's needed or when it's required, i.e. predictive type maintenance, which could very much take away and reduce maintenance cost. There's opportunities in street lighting, in the city, utilizing new technologies such as LED. There's opportunities in transportation. Parking, for example, is a challenge and expensive in the city, and there's opportunities to proactively communicate to drivers exactly where the spot is that's open, so you know exactly where to go to get to the spot, saves time, and maybe do some real-time pricing on those spots to charge a premium, when it's needed, and maybe it might be a revenue source for the city. But those are a handful off the top of my head.
Yeah, so maybe I'll close with a question that has come in through a variety of ways. How do the problems get chosen? I mean, one of the questions would you ever consider, something as infrastructural as a bridge if it fails, which is, the school system or poverty, but in the larger sense, how do you prioritize the projects? Because that was a great list. I want all of those, Dave. But how do you whittle that down? Is there a process?
There is absolutely a process. In fact, the process is very important to all of this. So first of all, we're focused on the infrastructure and built environment. So that means energy management, water and sanitation, transportation, and physical infrastructure, bridges included.
Mm-hmm.
But we purposely have not gone broader than that because that is broad enough in itself. There are, of course, opportunities in healthcare and education and others, but within the built environment, those are the areas we're looking at. But then we've got to look at, with all the problems, which ones do we actually have a potential to develop a solution around? So we go through a process. We've got 4 criteria. We're looking for things that are valuable, actionable, transformative, and impactful. And we've got lots of reasons about what do each of those 4 characteristics mean. And we go through this process in real time, working with our partners across the city, across the university, and the company partners, and making sure that before we actually start a project, before we start that water project I talked about earlier today, they've got to meet all this criteria and have industry recognizing that this is a problem that has real outcomes, and having the city, the commissioners, the deputy commissioners, the staff involved recognizing this is a real problem that needs to be solved. And so when we go through all of that, as you said, the problem definition is half the problem, then we can
What if it was a problem that many, many cities in the world face, but Chicago just didn't happen to face? You know what I mean? Especially with the globalizations happening in Far East and Middle East, would that be thrown out categorically?
Well, I don't think so. I mean, the process we've gone through to bring everything together was as Carolyn described. We started in a very broad way with, I don't know, how many people do we have in that workshop?
40.
We have over 40.
In the very
first one, over 100.
Yeah, we have about 100 different, probably 60 or 70 different enterprises of various sizes and shapes in the room, from insurance to major industrial partners, the Siemens, Microsoft, other big companies, et cetera. And we did a bunch of workshopping, and then part of it is understanding, what's available today that could be commercially off the shelf and we could sell it to you today and you could get an ROI, versus where are the edge cases where we can do things that would be solvable in some reasonable period of time, say 6 to 24 months. And that refining process is both complicated, but an important way for us to assess, again, scalable and measurable things on the other side. In Chicago, you got old, you got new, you got tall buildings, you got short buildings. You got it all here. So
we have it all.
It isn't like building a new city from scratch somewhere in China, where I'm sure you have those experiences where they can instrument with off-the-shelf stuff immediately. We've got a complicated set of problems, and guess what? Most of the world is built that way today, and so there's a lot of opportunity.
In that session, though, we did have a conversation with the commissioner of the water department about water scarcity,
The departments
which is
were
not
all
a problem
present.
here. We have lots of other water problems here, but scarcity isn't one of them. And he had some really interesting perspectives, though, on how the Chicago Water Department might be able to help address that issue for other cities that do deal with water scarcity.
Awesome.
Not something we're going to take on because we have a long list of our own problems,
Right.
but something we may actually come back to at some point, and how we would pilot that would be interesting, because we may not pilot that here, but it goes back to the comment about how we will likely partner with other cities in the future, where we may grow the technology here, but pilot it with a partner city that is dealing with scarcity.
Yeah, that was the kickoff, was having the department heads
Yep.
talk about their individual stovepipe problems and then the cross-department issues, which get into perhaps, internal policies about how things get shared. So really breaking the problem down from those, vertical domains or departments, and then, the ecology of the city, which is a combination of vertical, industrial, different kinds of applications, but horizontal layers of technology that tie it all together. So it's a big matrix of work, and Carolyn and team have done a good job of facilitating it for all of us, so it's good.
Friends, we are at time. Would you help me thank our panelists, Brenna, Dave, Dan, and Carolyn?